Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming to the Department of Interpretation and Translation Colloquium, our series. We're thrilled to have Dr. Flavia Fleischer, who's come from California. We're absolutely thrilled to have her here today. The department here has 4 series in the lecture series, 2 in fall and 2 in spring. In the few recent months, we've had a series, and we've provided videos for those. And we've archived the videos for the interpreting community to be able to see those, and they are available on the website. You can see that it says Colloquial Series, the Department of Interpretation and Translation, and the videos can be viewed there. It's really a fantastic resource. It's great to have the information available for the community interpreting transliterary and translation. I'd like to recognize the interpreters that are here today, Jackie Lightfoot, and additionally Natalie Veneman. So thank you very much for coming to interpret today. This is the second of the colloquial. We'll also have a third and fourth. After the presentation day, we welcome you all to go to the Gallaudet cafeteria to the second floor to be able to interact and meet with Dr. Flavia Fleischer and have that opportunity to chat with her. Students and faculty are welcome to come upstairs to the second floor. It's close to the dorms, to Carlin dorm and Claire. So you are welcome. Again, that's in the cafeteria on the second floor. Before Dr. Fleischer is introduced, I'd like to introduce Dr. Brenda Nicodemus. She's the director of the Center for Advancement of Interpreting and Translation Research. Brooke, this is Dr. Nicodemus that's speaking now. Hello, everyone. Good morning. We are fortunate today to have Dr. Flavia Fleischer with us here, right? Yes. I'd like to briefly make comment about what has happened with our structure of the lecture. Next, we'll have Dr. Keith Cagle come up, who will actually introduce Dr. Fleischer. And then her presentation will be approximately 30 to 40 minutes. And after that, then Dr. Stephen Collins will come and ask questions of Dr. Fleischer. And then we'll be open to the floor for questions. If you have any questions that come to mind, if you'd like to come up to the stage to ask them, that will be your opportunity to do so. And when that is finished, then we'll proceed to lunch. But that will be the structure for today. I think we'll proceed now and introduce Dr. Keith Cagle. And he will introduce our keynote.
Greetings and good morning to you all. It really is a great pleasure to me to introduce our guest speaker today, Dr. Flavia Fleischer. It is indeed a small world, and let me tell you why. I actually graduated with a Master's in Educational Administration from California State University at Northridge back in the day, 1991. And at the time that I was there, I actually met Flavia's father, Dr. Larry Fleischer. We worked together periodically. At that time, Larry Fleischer was the chair of the Deaf Studies Department at CSUN. Flavia Fleischer is now the chair of the Department of Deaf Studies, so that's a wonderful transition. Larry Fleischer was also president of ASLTA, the American Sign Language Teachers Association. He was also an evaluator, and in that capacity, as I was subsequently ASL-TA President and Evaluation Chair, I worked closely with Larry. So I feel as though I know Flavia, largely through my connection with her father Larry. Larry was a third-generation deaf person, and in terms of lineage, that makes Flavia fourth generation within her family construct. She acquired her PhD in linguistics from Gallaudet University, and her dissertation research was an analysis of American society's constructed images of deaf people. She got her PhD and has progressed to many wonderful accomplishments, including her current position as Chair of Deaf Studies at CSUN. So it gives me much delight and excitement to see the inspired, energetic and positive presentations that Flavia has given over the years, and thus great pleasure to introduce her today and invite her to the floor for her presentation this morning. Dr. Fleischer, over to you. Thank you for such a warm welcome. It is true that I am now at CSUN, but my PhD was gained here at Gallaudet University. My bachelor's, my second master's and my PhD are all from here. My first master's, because I do have two, it was from CSUN. So that's my academics for you. So just to clarify name signs, my father Larry and myself and my brother Flan all have similar name signs, so keep that in mind and don't confuse us. As Dr. Cagle just referenced, I am the fourth generation deaf person in my family, but my daughter is in the audience and she is fifth generation. She's graduating with just graduated with a bachelor's degree in psychology and is moving home to walk closer to us to start graduate school at CSUN. Not in the same field as me. She'll be looking at Master of Fine Arts and looking at physical therapy, but I did want to recognise that my lovely daughter is here in the audience with us today. As Brenda has just mentioned, I have a short 30 to 40 minutes. FYI, I'm going to be closer to 40 and possibly even pushing to finish in that time. So I am going to proceed directly with my presentation. But the things that I simply touch on and don't expand on, if you are curious, please feel free to ask me at a later point to expand on any features that I simply didn't have time to in today's presentation, as we do have time constraints. I think we live in interesting times for how this presentation is situated. We have just had a presidential election, and I think that now our discourse, as we look at it from the West Coast and the East Coast, requires us to partner and be allies and find out ways to work together in overt ways. And you might wonder why I think that's critical. I think that the person we have currently elected to the highest office in the land, in the US, who is taking that office, does not seem always to have the best interests of heart at many of the minority communities that exist within this country. So we need to start looking at what has fed that sentiment. What created the possibility that a person such as our president-elect, who does not again seem to have a heart or compassion for minority communities, has yet been elected. So I think we need to look at what is missing. We need to look at academia. We need to look at community epistemology and identify the specific structures and frameworks around which this has eventuated. So we're going to talk through that framework and then lead that to ways in which we can work together in a much more cohesive, collaborative manner. You can see my title, Incorporating Community Cultural Wealth into the Interpreting Profession. This is related with interpreting practitioners and also with interpreter trainers. So when I talk about academia, I'm talking about interpreter preparation, interpreter education programs, and interpreting practitioners. So I do see them as well connected. So I just wanted to mention that at the outset. I'd also like to recognise that interpreting as a field and interpreting as it stands within educational preparation programs, yet come within the structure of academia. And to me, that is how we marry theory with practice in a concerted form. We can look at that in a fairly narrow structure in terms of the communities that we invite into the field. For example, are we inviting the black community in? Are we inviting the queer community in? Do we invite the community of people with disabilities in? Because all of that informs our practice. So how we overtly construct invitations and welcoming to minority communities within our field, I think, is vital to today's presentation. That said, I have worked with interpreters myself on a daily basis since I was a wee child. It's a product of the 1970s, where mainstreaming became de rigueur. It was the most popular educational paradigm. There were residential deaf schools, but they were often isolated, so they weren't getting the children with the best opportunities for academic success to necessarily enroll there. Those children instead were put in mainstream settings. So I think that, to a degree, the students who were raised in the residential schools were not necessarily seen and valued. But we have to consider that in terms of the intersectionality of the deaf experience, looking at all of the communities that exist. Those who came up within the community, those who were raised up in the community of people with disabilities, looking at the queer community and all of those other demographics that we sometimes overlook. So when we look at the black community, the queer community, etc., we need to recognise the intersectionality of what that looks like in our constituent base and us as practitioners. What I think is absolutely fundamental to this is to recognise the residents of those demographic communities in our work. So as I said, I was raised working with interpreters from a very young age. And as I did so, I have noticed over the years, and I have worked with many interpreters, that some commonalities exist. The interpreters will often come with a strong language base and be competent signers, and in that regard be able to relay what's being said. But I would often find that I couldn't connect with what the speaker was really trying to address. So let's talk about first the paradigm that interpreting is not a natural way of discourse. It's an artificial construction. So when you think about what's being said, interpreters were often describing what had been said and interpreting that effectively, but not always effectively managing why things were being said, what the context was. So I am a white, cisgendered, female, deaf, able-bodied atheist. All of those identities exist within me in terms of my intersectionality, and I cannot remove one identity from the other in my existence and how I experience the world. Every one of us has a multitude of identities within our own intersectional construct as well. Some of the identities I have are privileged in this society. So being white, cisgendered and straight, for example, give me privilege. Some of the identities within my intersectionality are not privileged. Being deaf, being atheist, being a woman. What that means is that when an interpreted interaction occurs and we look at the text, we examine the text of that discourse as it's presented via an interpretation. Does it always connect with me? Not always. And I think that the same exists for all of us. We have to analyse that text in terms of how it relates to ourselves and how it relates to the other person. And again, we can never remove that contextual connection from one another. So as we look at the interpreting field, those connections and intersectionalities exist. As we look at interpreting training practitioners, it exists within academia and also within the community. So how do we marry theory and practice? And when I say community, I don't mean just one community, for example, the white deaf community. I mean all communities. All communities must be overtly engaged in this and recognised. So let me progress. engage in communities and we look at the interpreting fields and academia, we're looking at the connections people make in various facets of their lives. All of us work with people, regardless of their individual field of expertise. We have to interact. And we're designed as a bridge, if you will, to connect people, so we are never removed from one another's individual experience. So I think that we therefore need to recognise the intersectionality and the multitude of identities within each of us and how that intersectionality shapes us. So Pauline Murray is one of the first people who brought up the concept of intersectionality. Black, deaf, female, queer, I believe, attorney. So that term intersectionality was also brought in by Kimberly Crenshaw in later years. But the concept really came from Murray's original work. And the concept of intersectionality looks at examinations of a community and looking at the fact that there are more than one identity reflected and more than one language discourse represented, and that we need to recognise this and incorporate that. If we were to do so, what would it lead to? We'd be better able to understand the positionality of others with whom we interact, with discourse, with interpretations, and therefore our connections with people. And that, I believe, would make the interpretation far more robust. Now, language use and the interpretation process are interchangeable to a degree, and yet they cannot be removed from the people engaged in that interaction. So how do we understand that framework of looking at the community and academia and how they intersect and how they should best leverage one another? I think that is really the point of what I'm here to discuss today. So before I change slides, let me also add there are different bodies of work, bodies of research out there, and they may discuss the concept of intersectionality, but it's in terms of how they shape a person and a person's life experience. So when we look at the Latinx community or the Chicanx communities, we contemplate their origins. So those who are from Mexico often refer to themselves as Chicanx, but the overarching umbrella is Latinx. Under Latinx are the multitudes of communities, including Chicanx, that are recognized with that experience and that identity of being Latinx, and how that shapes people's experience. When we look at the Latinx deaf community and Latinx deaf women, those identities are never separated within the person. Carla Garcia Fernandez did her dissertation back in 2014, a really nice body of work, and looked at the idea of intersectionality and how it applies to and impacts on the communities and therefore should be reflected in academia. She was a black hearing woman who did, Lissa Stapleton was a black hearing woman who also did her dissertation work at CSUN. Her dissertation focused on the black deaf experience in higher education. How black deaf students navigate their way through academia and how they manage their success, and saying that ought to be overtly instructed in our teaching because of the validity of that experience. So when we look at the interpreting practice and interpretation services, look at education of interpreting, that needs to be central. We need to understand what those concepts are and how they manage what we do. The real lives of people, their experiential validity need to be incorporated, and their identity as members of non-privileged entities. It is rare to see someone who has an unprivileged or underprivileged existence brought up to the privileged environment, and make a bit of a joke, but we could say that the current political climate possibly reflects that. So why is it that we look at the majority or those who are privileged when it's not most of us? Probably 99.9% of us in this room are not in that majority privileged group. I'm about to start a discussion on oppression and the idea of isms. I know that the slide has a lot of text on it, so I'd like you to run you through first what it looks like before you get a chance to read. When I talk about the idea of isms, I look at the idea of epistemology and what knowledge, skills, experience and talents are valued and used and brought into theory and brought into practice. But it also looks at what knowledge, experience, practice, tools and talents we don't value, that we minimise, and why we do that. That to me is ingrained within the concept of isms. So I just wanted to touch on that first. The slide you'll see with the definition is long, and I will give you a moment to read it and then briefly explain it. And then again, if you do have further questions, I can address them later. Just get a sense on whether people have finished reading the definition. Great. So when we talk about what knowledge, experience, skills and tools are valued, they become the ones that are put in everyday practice, and others are therefore dismissed from that majority space. And they're not shared and invested in at the same level. Why does that happen? To me, the reason behind it is the isms. I've worked with a couple of colleagues in particular, including my husband, who is also a colleague, and we developed this definition of isms together, some of our work. It looks at the idea that there are a multitude of oppressions, but in that they are not all the same. Racism is different from ableism. Ableism is different from heterosexism. That is different from transgender oppression. So they are not all created equal, but they nonetheless all exist, and they do share some particular elements. Some of those specific elements are, firstly, the idea of the oppression experienced within that group, the prejudice, the ideas and thoughts we have about a particular group, and then our everyday actions based on those prejudices, which is what we would refer to as discrimination. So oppression and discrimination both exist in terms of thoughts and actions, but when they are combined with power at the systemic level, that's what comprises oppression. So how does that manifest? Let's look at racism. Within racism, black people are typically oppressed. Members of First Nations are oppressed. We look at how the Latinx populations are oppressed, and they may all be oppressed in different ways, but nonetheless at the root of that oppression, regardless of the myriad ways in which it's manifested, is that sense of systemic oppression, of taking away people's control, people's ways of control, and of others having control over your sense of agency. So that's the root of this. That oppression is the root of it. But that said again, it does not manifest the same way within these groups that experience oppression, but the oppression in and of itself exists. So when we look at, for example, the interpreting profession and the idea of oppression, all the communities have a sense of oppression, which means all of us are responsible to ourselves to push for greater understanding and to fight for all types of oppression to be relieved, not just for one particular type. Martin Luther King said injustice toward one person is injustice toward all. And that means we can't look at the singular. We must look at the plurality of that experience. And I think that's really important to emphasize, is that we have that responsibility to engage all members in our craft as we look at oppression and removing those walls. So again, let's look at how isms manifest. They manifest because of the overarching societal structures and constructs within which we live. They are passed down, built upon, dispersed, and pervade all aspects of history and society in a diachronic format. So when we look at societal constructs, we look at a particular group and we think this exemplifies the perfect human, and we humanize that experience with those characteristics and traits. That means, by necessity, when we look at oppression, we have to look at what is happening to those who have been othered in this capacity. They are dehumanized by comparison, and thus exhibits the imbalance that exists in our social constructs, and it emanates from those social constructs. It's not built on an individual basis. It's built through social connections, social networks, interactions, the social media, and is perpetuated thereby. So when we look at those overarching social constructs, that is what feeds us and feeds our manner of everyday response. It feeds on structures of within university. It feeds on how we look at what is valued. When we look at women in service professions and programs, how that's not valued by society, how other elements are. It's how we look at one another and the interdependency we have as humans. But within the United States, the social constructs we have here value a few particular elements. And those elements come from the social constructs of what we have decided is the epitome of human existence and human characteristics, and therefore the othering of all of those other communities that are seen as somehow flawed and dehumanized. And we dehumanize them in our approach to those minority groups. So what does this require from us in terms of action? Action in terms of what we can touch, taste, feel, what is tangible, I would say, almost always tangible, although sometimes not, because some of these social constructs are not quite as visible. So when we look at laws and how they work against us, that's not as tangible necessarily as some other aspects. So some things we have to experience in order to understand the impact of a law and how it reflects upon us in our daily experience. So I say tangible, but tangible to a point. So when we look at all of these elements that may be experienced by minority groups, we call them aggressions. And when we talk about aggressions, we have to give credit to another author, a black gentleman, Chester Pierce. His research in 1969 talked about the concept of aggressions. And he said, as members of the black community, their daily experience is of being oppressed, marginalized, of having their feelings, their thoughts, their experiences, their contributions not valued systematically. And it doesn't happen just once, it happens on a repeated basis. And that cumulative, iterative impact on the community is to see that this pattern, as it exhibits, becomes a schema for how people are addressed, how they are identified, how they're defined. We all have a schema, and a schema is that result of that iterative process and that experience. So again, back to aggressions. Let's talk microaggression. That can be on an individual level. It can be through an institution, for example, how a school system is built and how the community around that school benefits from that school, or how that school operates on inclusionary or exclusionary practices. That would be meso-aggression, and then macroaggression would be how the system at large, how the Federal Department of Education's policies, etc., impact. So when we look at an individual interpreter in their everyday scope of practice, perhaps sitting working with a team interpreter, when you look at those interpreters and the training that they have been through, the curriculum that they've been through, and their understanding of what it means to work in a team and their experience, we look at how all of that comes to practice. Are they open to the concept of different approaches to teaming? Do they understand that different approaches might even exist? Do our curricula, as we explain them, look at the community diversity perspective and how it therefore might reflect on working as a team? Does it support those constructs? Then we look at an interpreter, so think about for deaf people in general, that would be more at the macro level. But is interpreting for all of us? At the macro level, the mainstream community would say, no, it's just for deaf people. Well, it's not. Interpreting services are for all of the interlocutors. But you can see how that impact happens from the micro, meso, and macro level up, and then comes back down again. So as these aggressions accumulate through an existence, they pervade the system and lead us to the concept of some populations who are overprivileged, not because of something they did. All of us work hard. All of us are putting our efforts in to navigate life. So privilege is not based on something someone has done. It is based on the characteristics that have been envisioned at the systemic level, that are seen as positive traits and are therefore privileged over other traits that are not well recognized. So then we look at this imbalance. There's the underprivileged groups. So Tim Wise, a white male who's hearing, is an activist, has really been fighting against the idea of racism. And his statement is, when you look at the idea of overprivileged, the other side of that equation must be the underprivileged. So when we turn that conversation to the idea of epistemology and academia, who's included in the communities of knowledge and who's not included? It's based in this country. A lot of research shows, when we look at deaf studies, interpreting studies, ASL studies, predominantly on the white and the Eurocentric deaf approach. So it's an ethnocentric practice. And you might ask why. Again, it goes back to the societal constructs within which we live and operate. And if you're viewed as unequal, if you're viewed as underprivileged, your contributions are minimized and dismissed. So, a brief example. I spoke earlier of Carla Garcia Fernandez and her dissertation. I actually happened to see her give a presentation not too long ago. And she was talking about the sign for Chile that she used. And it looks like this. She arrived here at Gallaudet University and was talking about Chile and using that particular sign. And people said, what on earth are you talking about? That's not how you sign Chile. She said, that is the sign I use. What signs do you use? And people said, no, the sign you're using is wrong. You're just a wetback. Goodness, you can see there the relationship between the phrase and the identity and the view that they had as a social construction of who she was. And they're intertwined. Those kinds of views pervade our essence at the micro level. How many of you have seen the sign for Chicanx? It comes from the community. It's rooted in the community and the fact that there is very little separation between sense of self and sense of community in that regard. Let me think of another sign. Are you familiar with this sign? I see one or two heads nodding. Most people are not. It's a sign that can be used for chicken. So I'm going to talk about black ASL in just a moment, but as a quick example, let me just say, to start with, do we need to call it black ASL? Is that label even appropriate? And what does it mean when we say black ASL? Do black people not belong to the United States? Are they not part of the American experience? So again, these are related to how we present, how we name and label things, and they are infused within the societal construct within which we live. And I just think we need to have open conversations so that we can look at theory and practice, marry them into our academia, and marry them further into our professional practice in the interpreting field. I don't think we have yet fully incorporated this into our teaching, so we have a little work to do. But that's why I think that it's important to show this definition of oppression.
We have this definition here. We're talking about ism. And the definition is really ingrained in this concept, critical race theory. And that's been developed from a variety of different works of famous people that are in critical race theory field. Derek Bell, Gloria Ladson-Billings, Kimberly Crenshaw, Tara Yoso, and a long list of other people who work in this field. And they have developed this definition. Jeannie Gertz, she included this theory in her dissertation. She proposed the idea of a deaf crit. Understand, crit is strongly rooted in the black community and the oppression that was studied in their community and the black experience. The idea of crit was emerged and has expanded to also include other communities. Race crit is heavily related to the American experience. Race is central in the deaf community also. That is central, but also it's recognized with intersectionality. For example, the queer crit. We also have the femme crit, nat crit for First Nation, deaf crit, but this is also related to race as being central. We also must realize that we must name and identify the experience that has been perpetuated through oppression. We can't only focus on one experience of oppression, we have to include all and the way that people have exposed and challenged oppression. And this is what we call community cultural wealth. Community cultural wealth is the resistance against the system of how people are able to flourish and live and prosper. And it is amazing. We are able to navigate and break through and fight barriers and not sitting back lax and taking the oppression that we experience. Not seeing them as deficient, however, we leverage the marginalized groups and their knowledge and their wealth. And understanding and recognizing that they understand the system very well. And that has to be taken advantage of and used and incorporated to our teaching. So specifically here, when we focus on community cultural wealth, there's not only one, there are many, many capitals, many aspects of this. We have the black community cultural wealth, we have the deaf community cultural wealth, and they often overlap. So with black-deaf community cultural wealth, what would that happen to look like? If you would like to analyze this more, you can look at Lissa Stapleton, her dissertation. Deaf Latina with community cultural wealth, as that's combined, and what would that perhaps look at? You could also look at Carla Garcia Fernandez and her work. The deaf community cultural wealth, specifically from the deaf community, relates with how to resist the hearing dominant structure in society. That's just one piece of it though. And Jeannie Gertz with her work looks at that everything has value, but to recognize again that race is central to not just American, but to the U.S. and to the lives that we experience here as in the U.S. And a way of life. Community cultural wealth can be discussed in different capitals, as we see on the slide. And we can see there what we need to include in academia. So we can start here with a few ideas of how to incorporate this into academia. First and foremost, we have to come from a place of knowledge, experience and knowledge of all, for all of us. We all have multiple communication and language skills. And we often come from a place where my way of communicating and my language use is the best. And that's our opinion. We feel that it's superior. Ashley, as it pertains to English and ASL. We look at that, we feel that ours is absolutely the best, without question. And others' language and communication is unrecognized. And it seems as a deficiency. It's based on what we have decided is superior. And it's different from capitalizing on linguistics as one of the capitals. And talking here about people's access to language, also language efficiency, that's something that needs to be discussed, but as far as including other people's capital, as far as the Chicanx, for example, there's a variety of signs for Africa. There's a wide variety of signs. Do we understand and recognize the wide variety of signs? Do we promote the use of this variety and matching who it is that we're working with? Do we understand the emotion behind these signs? And this is something that we need to discuss. All language, all words that are used, all signs that are used are social, political, and they are connected politically to society, and therefore we can discuss oppression from there. And I don't think we do enough of this. We tend to focus primarily on the experience of the deaf white person, and fortunately that is just one example. Also that we notice accents. And perhaps an interpreter would say, I have a problem understanding them because of their accent. And why would that be? We're not exposed to or used to these sort of experiences in the community and what their community practices are. It's important, however, that we push people to break out of their communities and include a broad base of other communities. We should push the boundaries of our knowledge and of our experience and our skills in the interpreting profession, but also, most importantly, pushing our boundaries for the community, for those that are marginalized. Well, accent is just one example, but we must analyze. Often we'll say things like, it's their accent, but we just accept this as being the way it is, as if it's excusable. It may be excusable, I'm not sure, but this should be open for discussion. But we haven't discussed it. So that was linguistic capital. Now we're moving on to social capital. I sat with a student. They were a black, deaf, queer. I believe she identified herself as hard of hearing, deaf, queer. Hard of hearing, black, queer. And she grew up. She arrived at college. She had her first connection with deaf people. And she came to sit with me to talk about it. And I don't see it. She said that she doesn't feel like she has any deaf people here that look like her. I understand myself as a white deaf person. I asked her if she knew of NDBA.
So I asked her if she'd been exposed to NBDA, National Black Deaf Advocates, as one group of people with whom she might feel affiliated, and she didn't know. But my job as a white, cisgendered, straight, deaf woman is to also be a resource to other communities. I may not fully understand them, I may not fully be aware of the tools that they use, but I must be aware of their existence and be the resource for other members of our community. That is part of my responsibility in terms of social capital, to be that resource. There are resources already in the deaf community. There are resources in the black deaf community. If I meet someone who does not yet have a connection to them, it is my moral responsibility, it's an imperative to not simply say, there's Deaf Women United, there's National Association of the Deaf, but to also say there are all these other entities out here and to help people in my overarching community connect. But when she said she didn't know who National Black Deaf Advocates were, I honestly was a little bit crestfallen. It had a major impact on the idea of our sense of responsibility and accountability, and how she had come through life to this point in time not having a connection. That should never happen. We should all be collaborating in a far more overt way, in a far more conscious manner, to ensure that our resources are well connected within our communities. So there's something wrong in the fact that this is not our current paradigm. So when we look at social capital, it's the things that we look at and the things that we consider, and how we are or are not incorporating those into our field of practice in teaching interpreting and in terms of our work as practitioners. We need to look at the work. When we look at living as, we don't live without the deaf queer experience, we don't live without the deaf Hispanic experience, without women, without blindness. Life does not exist without all of those entities, and we therefore need to be reaching out consciously and connecting with those communities and incorporating that into both our teaching and our field of practice.
Moving on now. I warned you that I would be having a hard time meeting the 40-minute time constraints. Well, we may go past that time. So familia capital, it's more than, often it relates to networking. It's more than just social capital. It has to do with valuing, investing in another person, and recognizing and understanding that that investing will be two-way, and not being disconnected from that person, however having a close bond. And understanding that the fate of the other person is the fate of the person investing in them, and cherishing that investment. And understanding that interpreting would not exist without the community, but we should also know who we are investing in. Often we, in the profession, feel that we become a professional and that there's a division between us and those we serve. And a Eurocentric, ethnocentric approach that we become removed from the work that we're doing. And we develop ethics by which we work to make sure that we keep our separation and boundaries between us and others. But our ethics should be developed to keep us close and close-knit with those that we work with. the ethnocentric theory is not really beneficial to those of us that are not privileged by the society or by the system. So then what do we do? This familial capital is to invest in those, how we behave, how we respond, how we train people to support those in the situation. And this is turning the current theory completely on its head. Often interpreters will see a situation happen and they feel, it's really not my problem. I'm not involved. Is that true? Maybe as a profession, we may feel stuck, and that perpetuates the community's current situation. We should elevate the community through our work. Moving on to the next slide. So navigational capital, this is how we design spaces, not just physical spaces, but also our social interactions, theoretical space, whatever it may be, structural space. Marginalization are designed for people who have privilege, that fits them, and marginalized people are those who are not privileged. And space is not created for them. As a community that experiences oppression, it's not that we don't know how to navigate through. We do, and we're quite good at it. Studies show that many communities are similar, but one specific study shows that Black women who have daughters, mothers of Black daughters, are very good at being able to reinforce to their children that they are beautiful and smart and capable. And they are teaching their children how to resist. And we're going to talk about that next. But these overlap. And that is teaching their children. Teaching how to resist teaches the children how to navigate space in the dominant culture. Carla Garcia Fernandez. She has a lot of related examples for this. Carla mentions in her work her experience growing up. She felt that being included in deaf space couldn't also be a Latina's space. But then moving over in Latinx space, she felt that she could represent or identify as a Latina, but not as a deaf person. So it's our responsibility when we look at deaf space to also include all the other spaces and create an opportunity for navigation through that space. We have to make sure that we fit the needs of the other communities to create successful navigation and other ways of navigating through community experience and knowledge as we develop these ways to navigate through space. People often think there's one way to solve a problem, but is that true? There's just one way? Of course, there's many ways. We have to interact with them and their experience. And, for example, men solve problems differently than women. As women, we need to learn to multitask. We have learned to multitask. We can do many things because women have their experience and knowledge of the many things that they take responsibility for. And men in our society often do things systematically, one at a time, compartmentalized. And that's beneficial to them and creates privilege. And how do men identify as cisgender? But there's also a continuum. And that's something that we should include in our teaching. But this isn't something that everyone knows of, that women have to navigate, and they have to learn how to they've learned how to multitask. And perhaps we could apply that and teach that to others. It's an important skill to know how to multitask. It's very important. Interpreters have to do this every day. How to do the many things that interpreters do and the tasks that they do. Next slide. Speaking of aspirational capital. How do we behave in a way that shows that we support the dreams of the other person? Or do we behave in a way that tears them down and diminishes their dreams? It's a simple example again, but going back to team interpreting. This is a practice that I've noticed all over, and not just in any one local area. But of course there's that interpreter who is referred to as being the on interpreter. Now, the interpreter that is, quote, off, what kind of activities are they participating in? Are they texting? Are they on their phone? What message does that send? Does that show that they're supporting the aspirations and the motivations and the goals of those that they're working with? It's a very simple behavior, but it may only be something that occurred once in one certain situation, but actually when it's cumulative, then it creates a pattern. And the view is that the opinion of that interpreter is not supportive of the aspirations of the people involved in the situation. And how can we create a situation that supports aspirations? In our behavior, how do we need to discuss how we support through behavior and how we are not supported through behavior, and the behavior that isn't supported needs to be stopped. And moving on to resistance capital. I've already explained the black mother with black daughters and how they teach resistance to their daughters. In the deaf community, we teach resistance. In the Latino community, they also teach resistance. Resistance comes in a variety of forms, though. It's not one specific way, and each community understands the resistance. But what we teach interpreters is to be neutral. So again, going back, interpreters, there would be no interpreters without deaf people. So this means deaf black people, deaf queer people. When the interpreters must allow the communities, the variety of communities, to educate them. We've already progressed with academia, that they haven't included the communities. We've already discussed this in academia. They do have many important things that are of value in academia. However, they're not necessarily rooted in the community. And one of those, and that there's not just one way to resist. The variety of communities' ways of resisting needs to be included in academia. And how can we be neutral as interpreters and expect to connect with the people and understand, to be able to interpret their message? Text and discourse relates to the world, and plus understanding the why. So as we compile all these capitals, this will help us understand the why. And it'll also help us to stretch and become better in our interpreting field, better people, and also elevate the community. Our community as a whole and variety of communities will be elevated as we get to the why. And in summary, where did we start? So this is adapted from a book. It's a very thin book. Social justice leader was the author. Very 4 simple points. So I thought I would include it to share with you here today. First is awareness, then authenticity, then acuity, and agency. This helps us understand how we progress from here. awareness. So I have to understand myself as privileged, where I have privilege, the community experiences of the communities that I work in, U.S. history, the structure of academia. So that is awareness, and it's critically important that we understand that. Also, it must be authentic. Of course, we understand the communities, but the connection with people.
So you can't have authenticity without awareness, because one must know oneself in order to then engage in authentic communications. Now, when we look at the presidential election, again, the East Coast and the West Coast, we might say that a lot of awareness is missing, and therefore it doesn't look authentic. When we say we will work with all of these communities, or when we hear that, it doesn't feel authentic. Why? Because it doesn't feel as though the awareness is coming from the text of that person. But when you have awareness and you're striving for authentic connections with people and looking to understand their positionality as well as your own, what that leads to is an increased awareness of understanding, an increased acuity in what theoretical constructs need to change, how they need to change. We haven't yet arrived at that particular point as yet. Certainly not in academia. I think we're back at number 1 at this stage, and we need some work on that first. But again, it's looking at how we incorporate community epistemology, how we look at being authentic, and how that leads to acuity and application. Once we have those engaged, it leads to a sense of agency, the ability to know oneself and to teach other people, other communities, how to engage in the same practice. So we look at coming from a position of understanding in order to effect change. And it's not just deaf communities. Again, this is applicable to all communities. I do want to emphasize that. So, Anzaldúa was a scholar who wrote a variety of topics, including Borderland, La Frontera. And in that particular article, she defined several really important points, including the idea of decolonizing ourselves, decolonizing academia, decolonizing as it extends to our field of practice, the field of interpretation and the field of interpreter training. That concept of decolonizing emanated from her work. We also need to look at de-academizing. And by that I mean the concept of bringing in all of these communities and points of reference into academia. Building the body of knowledge and the theoretical constructs we have and using it to analyze. We can't do this as a one-way street and simply look at these communities through one particular frame of reference. It has to be done through that multi-communal epistemological view. So I leave you with all of those thoughts to contemplate, and I hope that these can be incorporated into your everyday life, your everyday practice, as interpreter educators, as students, as practitioners, that we can start with this analysis of self, lead it out to how we look at and listen to members of other communities, get all of us as equal participants in this space in creative, co-creative, collaborative ways. Thank you all very much. And Stephen Collins is going to be the respondent. There's an awful lot more I want to share, and I'm sure that you can sense that I really would like to be able to share it, but I don't have the opportunity here. But again, if you'd like to come up and ask questions after Dr. Collins' response, please feel free.
Dr. Collins speaking. Yes, can you see me okay? First, a round of applause. An absolutely fantastic job. Very inspiring, wouldn't you agree? Very impactful. I could mention so many things that would be able to be impactful on our field and our academics, and also the work that we do. Just absolutely incredible. I know that everyone is excited to ask a lot of questions.
I hope you are. I welcome your questions.
But just first, related to VRS, Video Relay Interpreting. I know that there's a wide variety available, and signing styles. Interpreters come from all over. So then how do we incorporate this with VRS and video relay interpreting?
I think as interpreting practitioners, if we're not including the opportunity to engage the community in the first place, we're missing opportunities to reflect our practice. So let's look first, though, at language teaching. When we look at interpreters, they may come in via formal language studies, or they may come in via the community and learn their language that way. So there are deaf interpreters and hearing interpreters, of course. But when we look at language teachers, by and large, that's the hearing students. It's not always. There are some deaf students there as well. And, here's to a different day when we're actually being taught by native users. But at this stage, that's not necessarily the case. So what is it that students in language learning courses are learning? The foundations of how they're approaching this. Are they being exposed to and welcomed into ideas of looking at multiple communities and multiple epistemologies? Are they learning to be malleable and adapt to and incorporate all of these different positionalities? Are they being encouraged to go out into the world with that aspect? I think that we're not sufficiently. There are specific types of communities that I think are emphasized in language learning when we look at ASL, for example. And perhaps it's because we think we can't find representation of these other models. But language is included even in that comment in a language political structure. So when you look at this sense, I would say when we think about K through 12 in a school system, how we discuss, how we dialogue, how we incorporate various parts of knowledge and society from those very young ages up. I know that we're not yet ready to solve the world's problems. I'm well aware of that. But if we start with these youngsters, we start with ASL instructors in the field, look at those who are in deaf studies and incorporate them, and then bring that into VRS more consciously, I think we would be better prepared. At this stage, however, I think that we expect people to jump into VRS sight unseen and go along without really having any recognition of the plurality of communities that are not yet being overtly brought to bear in our work. I think also it's important that we recognise our own level of self-awareness and our positionality. And not say, well, I can work in that community, whether it's different to mine or not. Can we really? We need to ask ourselves these questions in a very intimate, reflective way in order to effectively work with the community. And at what level? So if I have one deaf Latinx friend, really? Does that make me an expert? If I have 3 Latinx friends, what does that mean? What's my engagement within that community look like? So I think we need to be able to accept that kind of critique and look at and ensure that we are recognising those communities and how they impact our boundaries, self-imposed and societally constructed boundaries. So I don't have an easy answer for you, obviously, Dr. Collins.
No, Dr. Collins, I don't expect an easy solution for all of this. It's just something for us to think through. So yes, another one that I came up with, just something I want to put out there. Latinx. Is there a Deaf X?
So let me back up to why we have the X to start with. Originally, when we were looking at the Spanish language, how it's written, it has gendered nouns. So the ending of particular words denotes the gender of that. So Latino is male, Latina is female gendered. But that is only recognizing a binary gender differentiation. Sex and gender, obviously, are not the same. So when we look at someone who is born and they're female, we call them cisgendered females. But that's not enough either. That's not how our communities are really established. It's not how we live our lives. But it's more of a dominant heteropatriarchal view of how we look at the spectrum, because we see it in those respects as binary. So if we focus only on the binary, we are looking at only the male and female and ignoring the multiplicities that exist within those two ends of the spectrum. And that's defined as male and female only, and it is conflating sex and gender. But when we look at our real lives, we look how we can partner with our colleagues, and how can we do that effectively if we're not recognizing the multiplicity of within that spectrum instead of the binary. So within that community, the idea of Latinx came up. So deaf, in and of itself as a word, is gender neutral, so it doesn't need the X suffix, but it would be an interesting contemplation. And I say that again because the word itself is already gender neutral. But I will say that it is a predominantly white term, and I certainly could argue that because of how the community construction exists and the social construction, that the word deaf has been implicated in that. So it warrants further discussion. So thank you, Stephen.
Dr. Collins, thank you so much. I have one more related to deaf-blind. You mentioned the BASL. That really impacted me because we've also discussed TASL, tactile sign language, and being pro-tactile. So this is a new label for the community, PTASL. A variety of different changes that have taken place, also connecting that with the perspective we've discussed here.
So there is a field of linguistics that is trying to look at whether language is separate and whether differences are language or dialect. In determining whether any two languages are actually two separate entities or whether they are simply dialects. So when we look at how we measure or define those concepts of those particular language to see whether they are separate or connected, we have to recognize the pervasive power and history that already exists within how those languages are described. So I think that it's important that we have a discussion that doesn't say, well, it's obviously moot, but that instead says, are we understanding the same language or are we looking at dialect? Are we looking at the same language, and how do we know? The measurement is often gauged by our mutual understanding or our mutual intelligibility of the concept that we're measuring. So if we have a high percentage of mutual intelligibility, we'd say it's probably a dialect. Some words here and there that are different, but by and large we're understanding one another quite easily, dialect. If we don't have a high percentage of mutual intelligibility, then we're more inclined to say that it's two different languages. So that's one way to measure them. But I think that it's also really important to look at the terms themselves and how we're using them. So when we look at the idea of ASL, is it standard? Or do we often have these prefixes that we attach? Maybe these prefixes represent a dialect. But how do we recognize the power imbalance implicit in our thinking when we go toward analyzing things like black ASL and its value? Maybe putting black ASL as a prefix is appropriate, but maybe that instead reflects our constructed view of what we consider black ASL and say, well, there's ASL pieces there, but it's not really what this looks like. Your language is different from ours. I mean, goodness, look at that way of thinking. It really ought to go. If we can present and frame the discussion in a different way, I think it's more productive. And so my argument with black ASL isn't necessarily that we need the term there, rather that we need to have an open discussion about it. Linguistic theories are important to have in terms of the foundations of our discussion, but they don't exist without the community of reference. So I think that the discussion really has to happen in a more conscious way and find out how our nomenclature needs to adapt accordingly. The communities need to be incorporated into both our theory and our practice.
All right, Dr. Collins, thank you so much. Now it's time to move to questions in the audience. Dr. Keith Cagle is coming to the front for a question.
appreciate the framework that you've offered in this question and how important it is for us to recognise as interpreters, practitioners and instructors the diversity that exists within our communities at large and how we can incorporate that. And as you referenced, the President-elect has made fun of people with disabilities, has oppressed minority groups in a very overt, conscious fashion. And as we look to the next 4 years, I wonder what advice you might have for us as teachers and leaders in terms of what we say to our students. How do we guide them through the next 4 years? Dr. Fleischer, what a great question. I would flip it ever so slightly, though, to say, what will our community say? Because I'm not looking at a unilateral decision. I think instead we need to engage with and partner with our communities consciously. Look at the queer community and find out what they want to do in terms of resistance to this, how they believe it's best accomplished. Look at the black community, look at the black queer community and all of those other subgroups within our deaf world. If we can look at incorporating all of those views into what we do and how we think, then I am then responsible for my behaviour and I am accountable to it. Now, when we look at politics and the politicians, I think it's often hard for us as individuals to believe we can affect change. But again, we need to come back to understanding how that person got put in place as it stands. Obviously, we didn't have enough discussion in the lead up. I mean, he sexually assaulted women and that's been dismissed. He said horrible, heinous things, it's been dismissed. So where is our sense of accountability as communities? And I'm saying, yes, on one hand, the concept of forgiveness and love certainly exists, but we have to look at what have we done in the past that has enabled this eventuality to be the reality of our President-elect. Those conversations and community accountability have to happen for all of us. It has to happen in terms of social constructs, in terms of institutions. We need to be talking about what got us to this point. We also need to start saying, okay, to these other communities, how do you want this addressed? And find ways to collaborate and cooperate. We can't just follow one idea. We have to look at the multiplicity of ideas and views that exist and really push against and resist the current system with which we're faced. And honestly, I hope that it's not the case, but I think that the President-elect is in a bigger position to hurt many of our communities. And as I said, I hope that's not the case.
Dr. Collins speaking now. Does anyone else have a question? Any other questions from the audience? Dr. Shaw coming to the front now.
Take your time coming to the stage.
For those of you that would like to ask questions, go ahead and line up. Dr. Shaw speaking now. Oh, really a wonderful presentation. Really perfectly timed to connecting with Dr. Cagle's conversation, especially with on campus this week. What's really struck me is white supremacy. And for so long, people thought things were getting better. And now we've been just basically smacked in the face, realizing that this is something that's developing in our own lives. Mm-hmm. And we talked a lot about that with the interpreting department. How do we include that type of practice for our new interpreters? And part of that, how do we facilitate this work of their own identity? How do we pass that on to the interpreters to be able to provide access without being oppressive? But also we are required to include social justice in our work. And what does it look like? How do we do it? Part of it is exposure to diverse types of language, also, but then cultural experience, understanding my own upbringing, and the impression that maybe I have experienced myself and how other communities have experienced oppression. But do you have suggestions of what to do and how to proceed for the next generation?
Thanks for that. I think, as Anzadula said, we need to make sure that this is articulated consciously. When we look at the power, it must be handed back to the people in those varying communities, and we need to talk about how we can more effectively teach interpreters as the next generation by pulling on the capital wealth of all of these communities as much as possible, and start immediately. So if you're teaching a class, ask the people in that class how it's going. Don't put them on the spot. That's quite a different concept. Rather, invite them to the conversation. Invite their perspective in. Open the door for that. I mean, it's a temporary step in, if you will, for now. But in the long term, when you look at your students and your faculty, what do they look like? Is your faculty diverse? Is your student population diverse? Does your faculty experience reflect that of your student body? If you can ensure that you are reflecting diversity in the population with your faculty, then their cultural knowledge, their experience will reflect that of what the students are seeing, and I believe that that can have a huge impact. When we come to the concept of social justice, we often see it at this stage as a separate training, and I think that's why we're often a little uncertain about how to build in time for a social justice conversation. But social justice says the investment has to be there from the get-go. It has to be infused within the curriculum and all the curricular elements. So we need to look at what the curriculum is at the moment and how to change it so that it utterly and thoroughly incorporates social justice. I mean, I wish I had a better answer. The reason I think that I don't is because we really haven't started those conversations. We barely have our toes in the water, and the President-elect hasn't yet started. We understand the sexism and racism and heterosexism and xenophobic tendencies that we've seen exhibited in that person, but the term of office hasn't even started, and yet all of this is already seen. So we need to be looking at all of these forms of oppression, at all of them, before we can, I believe, make positive, effective change that will truly improve our experience on this earth. And if we don't do that, and we're not open to that, we will continue beating our heads against this wall.
Dr. Collins, we have time for one more question, and this will be our final question. Questions coming from the audience. We're thrilled about your topic. I'm glad you were here. I have a long list of questions. I'm just trying to figure out how to condense it into one. I do apologize. I wasn't here for most of the presentation. I was working at an interpreting assignment here on campus. I had to run to that and then came back as quickly as I could. But really wonderful information and a lot to consider. So, yes, wonderful. What would the practical numbers are sad. It's quite sad. In 2015, the number of people of color that were certified was significantly low. Most certified interpreters are white and certified. But when we're talking about faculty being able to match the student body, I'm not thinking about that increasing the number of interpreters of color and so forth and so on, and also being able to match the number of in the populations of those that we serve. I have so many more questions. I don't really want to stop there, but this is what I'm suggesting as my question.
Thanks, Candace. Have any of you ever watched Street Leverage? If you have, there is one particular presentation by Erica West Odiele. It is an outstanding presentation. She argues in sum that the practices that the field has thus entertained does not discuss racism, does not centralize that experience, and therefore how do you expect people of color to feel welcome in the field? How can you possibly expect it? So starting with that statement and looking at that space, we therefore need to create that space. Yes, it will take time to build, but we need to create that space and welcome those communities in. We can't have them create their own space and say we need to work together. We need to create the space in order for that collaboration to happen. We also need to seriously analyse the K through 12 environment. And I say K through 12 for a particular set of reasons. There is some interesting studies by some colleagues at CSUN that look at the idea of interpreters of colour, particularly meaning black interpreters, and the fact that they are just a small number in the field. So in theory, are we consciously dismissing that group? It's entirely possible. But I want to emphasise 99.99999% of people are well-intentioned. I'm not sure how our president-elect fits. He could be the 0.0001% instead. We shall see. But I will again simply say most of us, I believe, are good people. Our intentions are good. However, that's typically limited to our own ethnocentric approaches and those colonialised practices from the white patriarchal society in which we live that we have internalised. So when we look at ASL teachers as an example, and they say, oh, I look the same, I feel the same as this person, I can share my experience with this student, oh, but I don't have any cultural reference for working with this student, and therefore I'll retract my support, my consideration, my regard, and my connection. We know what goes on because we're not centralising race and gender, class. We're not centralising those, and yet they are central to our experience. And we need to examine that. If you look, for example, at class and how it intersects with race, typically white people in society, some of them may live in poverty, but when you look at the intersection, the highest percentages of people who live in poverty are people of colour, not white people. It's people of colour. So when we look at what that means, and we go to the K through 12 educational system now, we have the greatest sense of disparity ever. 90% of children of colour go to school with other children of colour. We are segregating them. If you look at poorer communities, and I'm not saying it's anything related to what that community has done, it's related to the societal constructs within which we live that have resulted in this. But when you have this, and you have children in K through 12 setting in poor communities, they don't have money for instruction. They don't have money for ASL classes. They may not have money for sports programs. May not have time or money for some of the academic and extracurricular clubs. So all of that gets subtracted from that child's educational experience. Probably the program they do have is the free and reduced lunch. But then you compare that with a school, typically a white school in a wealthier area. They have money that they can invest in all manner of things. Rarely in the free and reduced lunch programs because it's not needed there. Therefore, they can invest this money in other aspects. They're getting contributions from their parent-teacher associations, from their local communities. They're raising $2 million overnight from some fundraising event because of their privilege and their privileged network. So all of that means that there are many people of colour coming from high school that have never been through an ASL program, never been through a language program. So when they get to an IEP and they're being screened, who typically is the ASL instructor? Or who typically is filtered into the course? The white students. Because they're readier, they're more prepared for interpreting. But something is very wrong with that picture. So those of us who are willing to take accountability need to look out and look down to where we can change the pipeline and the demographics of the pipeline. We need to change what it currently funnels so that we can see more people of colour come into our future generations of interpreting practitioners. Now, look, there are myriad examples and reasons I could give you. There are myriad implications and myriad issues that impact this. But that said, I do think there is that larger issue, and that is that people of colour just don't feel like they belong. They don't feel as if they are welcomed, and we absolutely need to stop that. We all belong, all of us. A couple of audience members are saying they feel the same way. Thank you.
Dr. Collins speaking. Many thanks to you. I will now give the floor to Dr. Brennan Nicodemus for closing comments. Dr. Nicodemus speaking. Thank you so very much. I apologize that we had to interrupt you. So that word, interrupting the system, we've both experienced. We scheduled to have you do a presentation this summer, but this was really the perfect time for you to come, and we'll have to continue the discussion. I hope that we can continue this discussion as we go over to the cafeteria, and we can speak more with Dr. Fleischer. But before we go, I want to give you many thanks, and thank all of those who came today for keeping an open mind and an open heart. I also want to give you a token of our appreciation.
Dr. Fleischer, honestly, thank you for the privilege of the invitation to come here and speak before you all. It's very much appreciated.
Dr. Nicodemus speaking. Last thing, we'd like to also provide a reminder. This is our second colloquial in this series. We have the third one coming up February 10th. It's a Friday again. It'll be at 10 o'clock. We have our own Dr. Emily Shaw speaking, and she will be discussing gesture in multi-party interactions. So please, if you would come, continue learning, and thank you again. Have a wonderful day.